I remember that day so vividly, as if it had just happened. It was one of those lazy, golden afternoons where the sun seemed to hang low in the sky, casting a warm glow over everything. I had retreated to the stable, as I often did when I needed peace, a place where the world felt simple, where my thoughts could untangle themselves among the familiar sounds of horses snorting and the soft rustle of hay beneath their hooves. My husband was away for the weekend on a business trip, a routine I had grown accustomed to over the years. The house felt emptier without him, but it wasn't an uncomfortable loneliness. Or at least it hadn't been. Kevin, my husband's best friend, had been stopping by more frequently, offering to help with odd chores around the property. He was always around in the periphery, reliable and friendly, someone who blended seamlessly into the background of our lives. But on that day, something was different. It was as though an invisible line had been crossed, and I could feel the shift before I even saw him. I was brushing my horse, running my fingers through her mane, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, half expecting to see another stable hand, but there was Kevin, standing casually against the stable door. His usual grin was there, but there was something new in his eyes, something that made my stomach tighten in a way I didn't understand. "Hey," I greeted, trying to keep my tone light. "Didn't expect you to drop by." My voice came out calm, but inside, my heart had already begun to pick up pace. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, a different kind of intensity that was impossible to ignore. Kevin stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "Thought I'd check in, see if you needed any help," he said, his voice lower than usual. He was closer now, much closer than he'd ever been, close enough that I could smell the subtle mix of his cologne and the faint hint of sweat clinging to his skin. The space between us seemed to shrink, and I found myself feeling both exposed and cornered in the quiet intimacy of the stable. I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the sudden tension that filled the air. "I'm pretty much finished here," I replied, turning back to my horse, hoping that the familiar task would calm the rapid thrum of my nerves. But his presence was impossible to ignore. I could feel his eyes on me, tracking every movement, every breath, and it made my skin prickle with an unsettling mix of awareness and anxiety. The silence between us was thick, charged with an unspoken energy I hadn't felt before. Kevin had always been charming, but this was different. There was a weight to his presence now, a palpable tension that had nothing to do with friendship or casual camaraderie. My hand paused on the horse's neck as I felt the air shift behind me, and when I turned, I realized he had moved even closer. Too close. He was standing right behind me now, his body blocking the exit of the stable, casting a shadow over the golden sunlight that filtered through the cracks in the walls. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. This was no longer a casual visit, something had changed, and we both knew it. I cleared my throat, trying to dispel the growing discomfort. "Thanks for the offer, but I've got it handled." My voice was steady, but inside, the alarm bells were ringing. Kevin didn't move. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping even lower. "You don't always have to do everything by yourself, you know." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I couldn't deny the way my body reacted to his closeness. My heart raced, and my breath quickened, but it wasn't out of excitement. It was fear mixed with something I didn't want to name, something I couldn't acknowledge without crossing a line I knew I shouldn't. I stepped back, trying to create some space between us, but there was nowhere to go. My back was against the wooden stable wall, and Kevin was blocking the only way out. The tension between us was suffocating, thick with the weight of unspoken words, of desires that had no place in this moment. "Kevin," I began, my voice firmer now, trying to re-establish the boundaries that had always existed between us. "I think it's time for you to go." He didn't move right away. Instead, he just stared at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. For a long moment, it felt like the entire world had narrowed down to this one moment, to the space between us, and the line that had already been crossed in ways I wasn't ready to admit. But then, after what felt like an eternity, he stepped back, the tension breaking like a snapped thread. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice suddenly distant. "I should go." He turned and walked out of the stable without another word, leaving me alone with the echo of what had just happened. I stood there for a long time, my body still buzzing with the adrenaline of the encounter, trying to process what had just transpired. I didn't want to acknowledge the strange mix of relief and disappointment that coursed through me, the relief that nothing more had happened, and the unsettling realization that some part of me had been curious about what might have happened if it had. The stable felt too quiet, too still after Kevin left. The sunlight filtering through the cracks in the wooden board seemed harsher now, less warm, as though the innocence of the afternoon had been tainted by something darker. I didn't want to think about it, but the truth was impossible to ignore. Everything had changed in that moment, and I wasn't sure if things would ever go back to the way they were. As I stood there, the brush still clutched in my hand, I realized that Kevin had left more than just a physical space in the stable. He had left a mark, a question that lingered in the back of my mind, one that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. What if? For a moment, the world around us seemed to freeze. Neither of us said anything, and the silence that enveloped the stable was heavy, loaded with tension. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks, a mixture of confusion, fear, and something else, something dangerous. I searched Kevin's face, trying to make sense of the intensity in his eyes. Why was he looking at me like that? Why was the air between us charged with something unspoken? "I've been thinking about you," Kevin finally murmured, his voice low and husky. His hand reached out, gently brushing a loose strand of hair from my face. The simple, almost tender gesture sent a shock through my system, and for a brief moment I forgot to breathe. My mind screamed at me to back away, to stop this before it went any further. This was wrong, so incredibly wrong. Kevin was my husband's best friend, the man who had been part of our lives for years. He was supposed to be safe, familiar, a friend. But the way his fingers lingered on my cheek, the way his gaze held mine with a raw intensity I had never seen before, made my resolve falter. You shouldn't," I whispered, my voice trembling as I took a step back. I tried to create some space between us, but my back hit the side of the stable. My escape route was cut off, and Kevin took that opportunity to move closer, closing the distance between us again. I could feel his warmth, the steady hum of his presence, and my horse shifted uneasily beside us, sensing the tension. "I can't help it," he breathed, his eyes never leaving mine. His words were thick with desire, laced with something that both excited and terrified me. "You're all I can think about." The confession sent a jolt through me, my heart racing faster. This wasn't happening, this couldn't be happening. But despite the logical part of my brain that screamed at me to stop, to push him away, I could feel my body betraying me. The heat between us was impossible to ignore. I was caught in a current I didn't know how to escape from, and before I knew it I was leaning into him, my hand pressing lightly against his chest. His heart was pounding beneath my palm, mirroring the frantic beat of my own. And then his lips were on mine. It wasn't gentle, and it wasn't careful. It was fierce, hungry, as if the years of keeping things unspoken between us had finally snapped, letting everything pour out in this one forbidden kiss. I kissed him back with a desperation that surprised me, my hands gripping the fabric of his shirt as the world around us blurred. For that moment, there were no consequences, no boundaries, no rules. All that mattered was the fire that had been ignited between us, consuming everything in its path. But then, like a bucket of cold water, reality crashed down on me. I pushed him away, gasping for breath, my chest heaving. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. This was wrong, so wrong. "We can't do this," I stammered, my voice barely holding steady. My heart still hammered in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I tried to catch my breath, but the weight of what we had just done hung heavy in the air. Kevin stood there, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he struggled to control his own breathing. His eyes were dark with a mix of emotions: desire, frustration, confusion. He didn't move, didn't speak at first. When he finally did, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "You're right," he admitted, taking a step back. But there was something in the way he said it, something in the way he looked at me that made my stomach twist with unease. "But don't tell me you didn't feel it too." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Of course I had felt it, every heated second of it. But acknowledging that didn't make it right. It didn't erase the fact that I was married, and Kevin was my husband's best friend. The lines we had crossed in that moment couldn't be uncrossed. And yet, the pull between us had been undeniable, the thrill of the forbidden too powerful to ignore. But this couldn't go any further. I had to stop it before it destroyed everything. "I need you to leave," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Inside, I was shaking, fearful of what this moment meant, of the consequences that might follow. This can't happen again. Kevin's jaw clenched, his eyes flickering with a mix of emotions. For a second, I thought he might argue, might try to push the boundaries once more. But then he nodded, taking another step back, his expression unreadable. "You're right," he said, but the tension in the room lingered, unresolved. As he turned to leave, I watched him go, my mind spinning. I stood there, rooted in place, as the sound of his footsteps faded into the distance. My thoughts raced what had just happened. How had everything gotten so out of control, so fast? The stable that had always been my refuge, my place of peace, now felt stifling, as if the very air was too thick to breathe. I pressed my hand to my lips, still tingling from the force of the kiss. The memory of it, of the way his hands had felt on my skin, the way his body had pressed against mine, lingered, refusing to fade. I didn't want to think about it, didn't want to acknowledge the undeniable spark that had ignited between us. But the truth was impossible to escape. Everything had changed in that brief, stolen moment, and I wasn't sure if things could ever go back to the way they were. For the next few days, I was haunted by the memory of what had happened in the stable. No matter how hard I tried to push it away, Kevin's touch, his whispered words, the feel of his lips on mine, they lingered like a ghost, refusing to let me go. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see his face, feel the intensity of that forbidden moment, and with it came the guilt that gnawed at my conscience. I was drowning in shame, yet I didn't know how to stop the thoughts from consuming me. When my husband returned from his trip, everything felt off. It wasn't anything he said or did, it was me. I was on edge, my mind constantly replaying that afternoon with Kevin. I found myself watching Kevin whenever he came by, unable to ignore the weight of what had transpired between us. I kept waiting, wondering if he would say something, do something that would force the situation out into the open. The tension between us was unbearable, but I was terrified of what might happen if my husband noticed. It was like living on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the inevitable fall. Weeks passed, and I started to hope that maybe Kevin had come to his senses. Maybe he realized how wrong it had been, how dangerous. Maybe we could go back to the way things were, him as just my husband's best friend, a man who had no place in my thoughts. But that hope was shattered one evening when my husband was working late. There was a knock at the door. I opened it, and there stood Kevin, his eyes filled with the same intensity I had seen that day in the stable. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my heart racing, my hands trembling at my sides. "I needed to see you," he replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He closed the door behind him, and in that moment, I knew there would be no escaping it this time. The air between us crackled with tension, and I could feel the pull, the same magnetic force that had drawn me to him before. I tried to summon the strength to stop it, to push him away, but my willpower crumbled under the weight of his presence. He was relentless, his eyes never leaving mine as he closed the gap between us. And despite everything, despite knowing how wrong it was, I fell into the same trap. The thrill of the forbidden was intoxicating, the intensity of the passion between us overwhelming. It was a dangerous game, and I was playing with fire. But with every moment of stolen desire came the crushing weight of guilt. I couldn't look at my husband without feeling sick to my stomach. Every smile he gave me, every touch, every word of love, it all became unbearable under the shadow of my betrayal. I knew I had to end it, had to stop this affair before it destroyed everything. But Kevin had a hold on me, and no matter how hard I tried to break free, I kept falling deeper into the abyss. I was living two lives, and the lies were piling up. The thrill, once so consuming, began to feel suffocating. I was trapped in a web of my own making, and I didn't know how to escape. I knew it couldn't last, but I never expected the truth to come out the way it did. One evening, my husband came home early. I didn't hear him at first, not until it was too late. The moment he walked in and saw Kevin standing too close to me, his expression shifted. He didn't say anything, but I could see the realization dawning in his eyes, the betrayal unfolding in slow, agonizing clarity. The silence in the room was deafening, and my heart sank as the reality of what I had done finally came crashing down. The confrontation was brutal. My husband's face was a mask of hurt and rage, emotions he struggled to contain. "How long?" he asked, his voice low and trembling with the effort to keep himself together. "How long has this been going on?" I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was closing up, and all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by the weight of my own actions. When I finally managed to speak, my voice was a whisper. "It was a mistake." "A mistake," he repeated, his voice growing louder, filled with disbelief. "A mistake is something you fix. This is betrayal." His words cut deeper than I could have imagined. I wanted to explain, to tell him that I had never meant for it to go this far, that it had spiraled out of control before I could stop it. But how could I justify something so unforgivable? "I trusted you," he said, his voice breaking. "You were everything to me, and this is how you repay that trust." Tears welled in my eyes, but I knew they wouldn't change anything. The damage was done. "I never meant to hurt you," I said, my voice barely audible, but even as I said it, I knew how hollow the words sounded. The truth was, I had hurt him in the worst way possible, and there was no undoing it. The silence between us was suffocating. I tried to reach out to him, to bridge the growing chasm between us, but he pulled away, disgusted. His eyes, once filled with love and trust, were now cold, distant, reflecting the magnitude of the betrayal I had caused. "I can't do this," he said, his voice strained. "I can't even look at you right now." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there alone, as the weight of my actions settled around me like a suffocating fog. My world, the life I had built, had come crashing down, and I had no one to blame but myself. I learned, too late, that some lines should never be crossed, no matter how tempting they may seem. The thrill of the forbidden had blinded me to the destruction it would leave in its wake. And now, all I had left were the shattered pieces of a life that I had so carelessly destroyed. Kevin was nowhere to be found, and deep down I knew he wouldn't be. He had vanished the moment everything fell apart, when the reality of what we had done hit like a wrecking ball. I was left alone to face the aftermath, the broken pieces of my marriage scattered at my feet. The silence in the house was suffocating, an oppressive weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. My husband barely spoke to me. When he did, it was in short, clipped sentences, only saying what was necessary. The warmth, the laughter, the life that once filled our home had disappeared, replaced by a cold distance that felt impossible to bridge. I could see the pain in his eyes every time he glanced my way, and it shattered me. There was nothing more I wanted than to fix what I had broken, to find a way to rebuild the trust I had so carelessly shattered. But every attempt to reach out, every time I tried to explain, it only seemed to make things worse. He pulled further and further away. The days blurred into weeks, and it felt like we were living as strangers under the same roof. We passed each other like ghosts, the air between us thick with things unsaid. I knew I should be the one to bridge the gap, to make the first move, but every time I opened my mouth, guilt and shame choked me, rendering me silent. How could I begin to ask for forgiveness when I couldn't even forgive myself? One evening, after weeks of unbearable silence, he finally spoke. We were sitting at the dinner table, the clink of silverware against plates the only sound in the room, when he looked up at me, his eyes dark and distant. "Do you love him?" The question hit me like a slap. I had been bracing myself for this conversation, dreading the moment it would come, but I hadn't expected it to start like this. My heart pounded in my chest, and I struggled to find my voice, to form a coherent answer. But the truth was, I didn't know anymore. What I had with Kevin wasn't love, it was a moment of reckless weakness, a dangerous thrill that had spiraled far beyond my control. But how could I explain that to my husband, the man I had hurt more deeply than I could ever imagine? "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't love him. It was a mistake. A terrible mistake." He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable. "A mistake," he repeated, as if testing the word, weighing it in his mind. "You destroyed everything for a mistake. The weight of his words was like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath from my lungs. He was right. I had destroyed everything: our marriage, his trust. For what? A fleeting moment of passion? The realization of what I had done, how much I had thrown away for something so meaningless, was almost too much to bear. "I'm sorry," I choked out, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry." But the words felt hollow, inadequate in the face of the devastation I had caused. My husband pushed his chair back with a harsh scrape against the floor, standing up with an air of finality. "Sorry doesn't change anything," he said, his voice cold, detached. "Sorry doesn't fix this." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me sitting there in the deafening silence, my face buried in my hands as I sobbed. I wished I could take it all back, undo every terrible decision that had led us here. But it was too late. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and now I had to live with the consequences. In the days that followed, things only got worse. My husband began spending more time away from home, working late, staying out with friends. Each time he left, my heart clenched with fear, terrified that this time he wouldn't come back. I knew I had no right to ask him to stay, no right to expect forgiveness after what I had done. But the thought of losing him, of watching him walk out of my life for good, was unbearable. The guilt consumed me, gnawing at me from the inside, turning every moment of the day into a living nightmare. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I saw his empty chair at the dinner table, or heard the front door close behind him, a fresh wave of panic washed over me. I had lost him, and I knew it. I just didn't know when he would finally decide to make it official. I spent my days in a fog of regret, replaying every choice, every action that had led us here, wishing with everything I had that I could go back in time. But no matter how much I wished, no matter how deeply I regretted it, there was no undoing what had been done. One night I sat alone in our bedroom, the silence stretching endlessly around me. I stared at the wedding photo on the dresser, the two of us smiling, so happy, so full of hope for the future. The future we had planned was gone now, shattered by my own hand. And as I sat there, my mind raced with the realization that I might never see that smile again, that the man I had loved so deeply could never look at me the same way again. When he finally came home that night, I heard the door open, the soft sound of his footsteps down the hall. I wanted to run to him, to beg for one more chance, to promise that I would do whatever it took to make things right. But when he stepped into the room, the look in his eyes stopped me cold. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his voice steady, controlled, and I knew then that this was it. This was the moment I had been dreading, the moment where everything truly fell apart. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion, bracing myself for the words I knew were coming. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice breaking just slightly. "I can't keep pretending that everything's okay, because it's not. I love you, but I can't trust you. And without trust, there's nothing left." The finality of his words hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt the tears welling up again, but I didn't try to stop him. I knew this was my fault, knew that I had done this. And as he turned to walk out the door, I realized that this was the price I had to pay for crossing a line that should never have been crossed. That evening, the house felt eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making every breath seem louder than it should. I sat on the edge of the couch, my thoughts heavy, when I heard the front door creak open. My heart raced, part hope, part dread, as I stood, expecting my husband to walk in. Maybe this would be the moment we could talk, the moment where the ice between us would finally break. But it wasn't him. Kevin stepped through the door, his figure casting a shadow in the dim light. My body stiffened at the sight of him, the air between us crackling with unspoken tension. The last time I had seen him, everything had imploded. The sight of him now was like reopening a wound I had fought so hard to close. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended, edged with both fear and anger. I took a step back, instinctively creating distance between us. "I needed to see you," he said, closing the door behind him as if sealing us in, as if shutting out the world. "We need to talk." I scoffed, crossing my arms over my chest like a shield. "There's nothing left to talk about. You've already done enough damage." But Kevin, ever persistent, stepped closer, his eyes filled with something that looked like regret, or was it desperation? "I never wanted this," he said quietly, his tone almost pleading. "I never meant for things to fall apart like this. I never wanted to hurt you." His words felt like a slap, and before I knew it, bitter laughter escaped my lips. "Hurt me," I echoed, the disbelief thick in my voice. "Kevin, you've destroyed my life. My marriage is in pieces, and it's because of you." He winced, visibly recoiling at the accusation, but he didn't retreat. I know," he said, his voice softening as if trying to soothe the jagged edges of my anger. "But you can't deny that there was something between us. You felt it too." I shook my head, frustration and fury battling within me. It doesn't matter what I felt, it was wrong. I was wrong. And now I'm paying for it. My voice cracked, the weight of my actions finally catching up with me, the reality of what I had lost hanging in the air between us. Kevin reached out, as if he could somehow make things better with a touch, but I flinched, stepping back. "Please," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Just go. I don't want to see you again." For a brief moment, Kevin hesitated, his hand lingering in the space between us, but eventually he nodded. His shoulders slumped as he turned towards the door, and the sound of it closing behind him was like a final punctuation mark on the chaos we had created. The instant he left, relief washed over me, but it was fleeting, quickly replaced by the cold weight of guilt that settled deep in my chest. I had crossed a line that could never be undone, and now I was standing alone, facing the wreckage I had brought into my life. In the end, my marriage didn't survive. The day my husband left, the silence in the house became unbearable. He couldn't forgive me, and I couldn't blame him. The trust that had taken years to build was gone in an instant, shattered by my choices, by my weakness. There were no more conversations, no more chances. He packed his things, and with every item he took, a piece of our life together disappeared. Kevin vanished too, slipping away as quietly as he had entered my life. Perhaps he knew there was nothing left to salvage. Perhaps he too was ashamed. It didn't matter anymore. I was left alone, standing among the ruins of what had once been my happiness. Looking back now, I see how foolish I had been. I let myself be swept up in something I knew was wrong, something that was never worth the cost. The thrill, the fleeting passion, it wasn't worth losing everything that truly mattered. I had gambled everything and lost. I lost the man I loved, the life we had built together, and for what? A fleeting moment of desire, a mistake that spiraled out of control. I learned the hardest way possible that some mistakes can never be undone, that some lines once crossed can never be uncrossed. The consequences of my actions weighed heavier than I ever imagined they would. The thrill of the forbidden had faded, leaving only regret in its wake. As I sit here now, reflecting on it all, I wonder what my life would have been like if I had made different choices, if I had resisted temptation, if I had been stronger, if I had fought harder for what truly mattered. But wondering doesn't change anything. The past is fixed, immovable, and I am left to live with the consequences. If you're listening to this and it resonates with you, if you found yourself standing at the edge of a choice that could change everything, I urge you think carefully. Some lines aren't worth crossing, no matter how tempting they may seem. Thank you for listening to my story. If it struck a chord with you, please like and subscribe. I'll be sharing more stories about mistakes, redemption, and finding hope in the darkest of times.